Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. How many times have you told yourself, this is it? This time, I'm done. I'm changing everything, starting Monday. How many Mondays have come and gone? How many fresh starts turned into the same old finish? I've been there. Most of the people in this room have been there. And here's what I've learned after decades of studying human behavior, sitting across from CEOs, athletes, soldiers, and everyday men and women who were tired, genuinely tired, of being prisoners to their own patterns. The problem was never willpower. The problem was never motivation. The problem was the size of the step. See, we live in a culture that worships the dramatic, the before and after photo, the overnight transformation, the rock-bottom moment followed by the miraculous comeback. And because we've been sold that story over and over again, we believe that change has to feel big to be big. So we go all in. We cut everything cold turkey. We overhaul our entire life in a weekend. And within 2 weeks, sometimes 2 days, we crash. And then we don't just lose the battle. We lose something far more dangerous. We lose belief in ourselves. But what if I told you there's a different way? A quieter way. An ancient way. Forged not in a boardroom or a self-help seminar, but on the factory floors of post-war Japan, in the minds of a people who understood something that the Western world is still trying to catch up to. It's called Kaizen. And before you think this is just another productivity buzzword, I need you to understand what this philosophy really is at its core. Kaizen, in its most honest translation, simply means change for the better, not change for the dramatic, not change for the applause, change for the better. One small, deliberate, courageous step at a time. And the Japanese didn't just philosophize about it. They lived it. They rebuilt an entire nation with it. Now here's what modern neuroscience is finally confirming what Kaizen always knew. Your brain, my brain, every human brain on this planet is hardwired to resist big change. The moment you announce to your nervous system that you're about to do something radically different, it panics. It sends fear signals. It creates friction. It talks you out of it before you even begin. But when the step is small, almost laughably small, the brain doesn't sound the alarm. It lets it through. And that tiny step becomes a habit. That habit becomes destiny. 1% better. That's all Kaizen asks of you. Not 100%. Not 50. 1. Because 1% better every single day, and I want you to do this math in your chest, not just your head. 1% better every day means you are 37 times better by the end of a year. 37 times. From 1%. So today, we're not going to talk about burning your old life down. We're going to talk about outgrowing it. Quietly, consistently, permanently. Because the Japanese taught us something that no quick fix ever could. The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. And gentlemen, it's time to pick up your stone. Most of us have stood in front of a mirror at some point. Maybe after a rough night, a moment of honesty, or a quiet Sunday when the noise of life finally settles, and made a promise to ourselves. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere tired, somewhere that genuinely means it. We say, I'm done. Tomorrow, everything changes. And in that moment, we believe it completely. The intention is real. The emotion is real, the desire to be different is absolutely real. But then tomorrow comes, and the day after, and slowly, quietly, that fire that felt so powerful in the mirror begins to flicker. Within days, sometimes hours, the old patterns creep back in. The cigarette gets lit, the phone gets scrolled, the junk food gets eaten, the excuse gets made. And suddenly, we're not just back to square one, we're worse than square one. Because now we're carrying the extra weight of failure on top of the habit we were trying to escape. This is the brutal cycle that millions of people live inside of, and very few talk about honestly. We don't just fail to break the habit, we begin to believe that we are the habit, that we're weak, that we're broken, that change is available for other people but not for us. And the reason this keeps happening isn't a character flaw. It isn't a lack of desire. It isn't that you don't want it badly enough. The reason is far simpler and far more fixable than that. We have been conditioned by culture, by social media, by every transformation story we've ever consumed, to believe that real change must be radical, that it must be loud, that it must happen all at once or not at all. So we set targets that would intimidate a professional athlete and then wonder why we, living ordinary lives with real pressures and real fatigue, can't sustain them past the first week. The honest truth is this: overnight transformation is largely a myth dressed up in highlight reels. What you don't see behind those dramatic before and after stories is the invisible infrastructure of tiny, consistent decisions that actually built the result. You see the destination, but not the 10,000 small steps that quietly got someone there. And when we compare our beginning to someone else's finish line, we don't just feel behind. We feel hopelessness is not weakness. It is the natural response to an unrealistic standard. And until we challenge that standard, until we give ourselves permission to start small, the cycle will keep repeating itself with different habits and the same painful ending. There is something quietly profound about a word that carries an entire philosophy inside it. Most words simply label things. They point at objects, actions, emotions. But every once in a while a word arrives that doesn't just describe a concept, it embodies a way of living. Kaizen is one of those words, and if you've only ever heard it used in a business meeting or seen it printed on a motivational poster, then I want to introduce you to what it actually means. Not just in translation, but in spirit. The word Kaizen comes from two Japanese characters, Kai meaning change, and Zen meaning good, or better. Together they form something beautifully simple: change for the better, not change for the dramatic, not change that impresses strangers on the internet, not change that burns everything down and starts from ash. Simply, honestly, change for the better. That's it. And yet within that simplicity lives one of the most powerful behavioral frameworks ever applied to human life. What most people don't realize is that Kaizen wasn't born in a philosophy classroom or a meditation retreat. It was born out of necessity. After World War II, Japan was a nation in ruins, economically devastated, industrially crippled, and trying to rebuild from the ground up with very limited resources. American business consultants were brought in to help revive Japanese manufacturing, and they introduced concepts around continuous improvement and quality management. But the Japanese didn't just adopt those ideas, they deepened them. They rooted them in their cultural understanding of patience, discipline, and respect for process. And what emerged was Kaizen, a national mindset that said, we don't need giant leaps, we need better steps. Toyota became one of the most celebrated examples of this philosophy in practice. Their production system wasn't built on revolutionary breakthroughs that happened overnight. It was built on a culture where every single worker from the factory floor to the executive suite was empowered and expected to identify small problems and make small improvements, consistently, every single day. The result wasn't just better cars. It was one of the most efficient and respected manufacturing systems the world had ever seen. Built not by geniuses, but by people committed to getting slightly better than yesterday. And here is what makes Kaizen so relevant to you and to me, to anyone sitting with a habit they cannot seem to shake. It removes the pressure of perfection. It doesn't ask you to be a different person by Friday. It asks you to make one better choice than you made yesterday. It asks you to respect the process enough to trust that small, consistent improvement is not the slow road to change. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings. We make a decision, we commit to it, and we follow through. That's the story we tell ourselves. But anyone who has ever set an alarm for 5 a.m. and turned it off at 5 a.m., anyone who has ever promised themselves they'd quit something and found themselves doing that exact thing 3 days later, knows that the human brain doesn't quite work the way we'd like it to. And understanding why, not just accepting it as personal weakness, but genuinely understanding the mechanics behind it, is what separates people who eventually change from people who spend a lifetime wondering why they can't. Here is what neuroscience has been telling us for years, and what Kaizen understood long before the brain scans existed to prove it. Your brain has one overriding priority above all others, and that priority is not your happiness. It is not your growth. It is not your goals. Its priority is your survival. And to your brain, anything unfamiliar registers as a potential threat. Change, real, significant, dramatic change, triggers the amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for fear and threat response. The moment you declare war on your old life and announce a complete overhaul of your behavior, your brain doesn't celebrate. It panics. It floods your system with resistance, discomfort, and anxiety. It starts negotiating with you. It reminds you of every time you've tried and failed. It makes the couch feel safer than the gym, and the cigarette feel more comforting than the cold turkey quit. This is not weakness. This is biology. And fighting biology with willpower alone is a battle most people are destined to lose, not because they aren't strong enough, but because they're using the wrong weapon. This is precisely where Kaizen becomes not just a philosophy, but a neurological strategy. When the step is small enough, genuinely, almost embarrassingly small, the brain doesn't trigger that fear response. It doesn't sound the alarm. A 2-minute walk doesn't threaten survival. One glass of water instead of one soda doesn't register as danger. Reading 1 page instead of 0 doesn't overwhelm the system. These micro-actions slip quietly past the brain's resistance, and in doing so, they begin to build something extraordinarily powerful. A new neural pathway. And every time that small action is repeated, the pathway gets a little stronger, a little wider, a little more automatic. What began as a conscious, deliberate choice slowly starts becoming the path of least resistance. The brain that once fought your change begins to expect it. And what the brain expects, it eventually protects. That is the quiet genius of small steps. They don't ask your brain's permission. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from doing the right thing and feeling like nothing is happening. You've been consistent for a week, maybe 2. You've made the small changes, kept the promises to yourself, shown up when you didn't feel like it. And yet when you look in the mirror, when you measure the results, when you compare where you are to where you want to be, it feels like you've barely moved. And that gap, that painful, discouraging gap between effort and visible result, is where most people quietly give up. Not dramatically, not with a declaration. They just slowly stop. Because the progress felt invisible, they concluded the progress wasn't real. But here is the truth that mathematics will defend even when your emotions won't. 1% doesn't look like much. Standing alone, in a single moment, it is almost laughable. If you are a little more patient today than you were yesterday, nobody applauds. If you drink 1 less sugary drink this afternoon, no one hands you a trophy. If you spend 5 fewer minutes on a destructive habit before bed tonight, the world doesn't pause to acknowledge it. 1% in isolation feels like almost nothing, and that feeling is precisely what makes it so dangerous to underestimate. Take that 1% and compound it. Apply it not just to today, but to every day that follows, consistently, without interruption, for an entire year. The mathematics of compound growth, the same principle that makes investments grow exponentially over time, produces a result that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. 1% better every single day for 365 days doesn't make you 37% better. It makes you 37 times better. Not incrementally ahead. Exponentially transformed. The same formula that feels invisible in week 1 becomes unrecognizable by month 12. James Clear articulated this beautifully, but the Japanese lived it generations before it became a best-selling concept. The Kaizen practitioners didn't chase the dramatic monthly breakthrough. They honored the daily, almost imperceptible improvement. They understood intuitively what compound growth would eventually prove mathematically. That the most powerful changes in the world don't announce themselves daily. They accumulate silently, beneath the surface, like interest building in an account you check once a year and suddenly can't believe the balance. This is why consistency will always outperform intensity. The person who does a little, every day, without fail, will inevitably surpass the person who does a lot, occasionally, whenever motivation strikes. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings are seasonal. But a 1% commitment, practiced daily, becomes something motivation could never manufacture on its own. Of all the lies that bad habits tell us, the most dangerous one is this, that we are the habit, that the thing we keep doing in our weakest moments is somehow a true and accurate portrait of who we are as a person. The smoker begins to believe he is a smoker not just in behavior, but in identity. The man who procrastinates begins to see laziness not as a pattern, but as a personality. The person trapped in cycles of negative thinking stops calling it a habit and starts calling it their nature. And the moment that shift happens, the moment the habit stops being something you do and becomes something you are, the walls of that prison become almost invisible, because you stop looking for the door. This is perhaps the most important thing Kaizen philosophy quietly corrects, not through confrontation, but through a gentle and persistent redirection of how we see ourselves. Because Kaizen doesn't begin with action, it begins with decision. And that distinction, as small as it may sound, carries an enormous amount of weight. The moment you make a genuine decision to improve, even by 1%, even in the smallest imaginable way, something shifts inside you that is deeper than behavior. A new story begins, and identity, unlike habit, doesn't need weeks of repetition to take root. It can change in a single moment of honest commitment. The psychologist and philosopher William James once observed that the greatest revolution of his generation was the discovery that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes of mind. He wasn't talking about toxic positivity or wishful thinking. He was talking about the profound power of self-perception, the understanding that how you see yourself will always precede how you behave. You don't act your way into a new identity. You decide your way into one, and then the actions follow with far less resistance than you ever expected. Kaizen honors this sequence completely. It doesn't demand that you fix everything before you feel different about yourself. It asks only that you make one better decision today than you made yesterday, and in doing so, quietly whisper to your own subconscious, I am someone who is getting better. Not someone who has arrived, not someone who is perfect. Someone who is moving. And that subtle internal shift from I am my habit to I am my decision is where the real transformation lives, long before the results become visible to anyone else. Because the habit was never the truest version of you, it was only the loudest one. And the moment you decide to change, you have already begun to prove that.